I heard a story a while back of a woman named Sonia. She only had a third grade education. She had been raised in foster homes all her life. Of course, there was a lot of abuse and neglect. And she married at the age of 13 to a man that was 15 years older than her, that promised to help her escape from the abuse. And for a while he did. For a while he was very attentive and seemed to cherish her till the kids came along. And then she noticed conversations, and he wasn't nearly as present, and he would disappear for days at a time. So eventually she had to make the decision to leave with her two boys, went and lived with her sister. And somewhere along the line, even though Sonia did not have beyond a third grade education, she understood that education was the way out of poverty for her boys. And she, even in that desperate situation, had a deep understanding of God, prayed for his wisdom and guidance. And so when her fifth grade son came home with a very poor report card, she got to her knees and she said, Lord, this isn't going to work. I need your help. I need your wisdom. So she devised a plan. She created new household rules. She limited their television and took them to the library. They had to read a book once a week and write a book report. So, the boys being boys didn't like it, but they did it, and their grades started to improve. There was just one little snag in the plan. Sonia couldn't read the book reports. And eventually her sons figured that out. But it didn't matter because that's what she was doing, and they did it. And by now you may recognize this story. Does anyone know that we're talking about Sonia Carson, the mother of Ben Carson, who is world-renowned as a neurosurgeon. In fact, he successfully completed the only successful completion of separating conjoined twins, the only ones that survived. And his brother wasn't a slacker either. He had a degree in aeronautical engineering or something I've never heard of. But in our discussion of leadership, again, we talked this morning about how leadership is different than management. Sonia was never in a management position. She never managed a department. She never managed really anything, but she was a leader. And she exercised just tremendous influence over her sons to the point where Ben was the one that came home in fifth grade with bad report card. By the time he graduated high school, his SAT scores were in the top 90 percentile, high enough to earn him acceptance into Yale University. So her situation didn't change overnight, but she knew that it was going to change because she took the steps necessary. And this would be a classic case of someone that we would say did not have a choice in life, as we talked about earlier this morning. Nobody would have blamed her if she and her sons would have become a statistic. I mean, everything was against her in leaning in that direction. But she did. She, by the grace of God, took action and through that changed the course of history. So we're going to spend some time talking this afternoon on very practical steps that we can take to increase our own influence. And so I've broken this down into 4 points. And the first one is labeled what I call stick your landing. Stick your landing. And all I mean by that is make a decision in a reasonable amount of time and stick to it. And the reason why is I really feel that a leader can lose their credibility faster than anything else by making a decision and changing it, by not following through with a decision or not making a decision. So we're going to talk through those steps. How many of you are familiar with Harriet Tubman? You probably remember her from high school. So she was the famed conductor of the Underground Railroad. So Harriet Tubman was born into slavery, suffered a lot of abuse and beatings. She was beaten so badly one time that she was in a coma for several days and had irreparable brain damage. She later married to a man that was free, but when he didn't share her same quest for freedom, she ended up leaving him. So now, as we know from the story, this courageous woman took over 19 journeys from the South to deliver slaves to the North to freedom, and came back and got more and went back. And to her credit, she never lost a single person. Well, I read a story recently that kind of explained why she may not have lost anyone. So there were times when people would be afraid and not want to go forward, start to understand the consequences, and they would want to turn back. And so she would help them regain their courage by putting a pistol to their head and saying, "Dead men don't tell tales." Now, what's interesting about this is obviously people followed her en masse, men, women, children, and holding a pistol to your head, that's part of her influence. However, that's not the only reason they followed her, because these were people that made that decision on their own. They understood the risks. But Harriet understood that if someone were captured by their owner, they would be tortured until they gave up information about who else escaped. So my working theory is that the reason that people were willing to follow Harriet Tubman is because they understood that she was not going to allow some weak-willed, wimpy person to endanger them or their families. She stuck her landing. And the fact that I think we've all dealt with indecisive leaders. It's human nature. Sometimes we don't want to risk making a decision, or we don't know what to do. But there's something that happens when people in authority don't make a decision. It creates what we call a leadership vacuum. And what this does is this allows room for unscrupulous characters and bad actors to fill that gap and make choices that are going to benefit their own agendas. There was a 60 Minutes report, did anybody see that? On Kabul, Afghanistan. So back in 2004, we had a very strong presence in Afghanistan, and we maintained the peace there for a while. Right around 2014, 2015, there was a decision by the government to pull troops out. Now, this report was from 60 Minutes, and what happened is it created a vacuum. So there was no longer leadership in place to enforce rules or to keep the peace. Kabul is now the home of 21 international terrorist groups. So that's obviously an extreme example of what we're talking about with the leadership gap. But we're going to talk about a couple others. So, and I think I may have mentioned earlier, I'm reading this book called Extreme Ownership, and it's written by a couple of Navy SEALs. And so they talk about the leadership principles that made them successful as SEALs, and then they took those skills and they started a business where they did some consulting. And so Leif, who's one of the authors, was consulting with this company. The CEO's name was Kim, and Kim had a problem. She had two of her regional managers that were they refused to work together. They just did not get along. These two men, we'll call them Pete and Eric. Pete and Eric, they even tried to intervene. She tried to meet with them to see if they could work through any differences. It was unsuccessful. It got to the point where Pete actually called Kim out of a leadership conference that she was at in another city and called for her to fire Eric. Well, Eric couldn't be outdone, so of course he called her up and asked for Pete to be fired. So when her coworker asked her about it and said, well, what are you going to do? She said, I don't know, I think I might just let it play out. Now Leif, who was the Navy SEAL who was consulting with her, said, you know, I have another idea for you. He said, fire them both.
Easy.
Easy, yes, because it was well known that they were both interviewing with other companies, and she was so afraid of losing their skills that she overlooked what they were doing to the rest of the company. And so what they found she did, she made that decisive action to fire both of them. They quickly found people within the company that had the skill sets and that were positive forces and had a following within the company, and turned out to be a very profitable decision. But you know, we don't like those kind of things, and we don't like having to make choices sometimes. I know I referenced the book this morning, Necessary Endings. But this is what leaders do. We make decisions. And when we don't, you know, and this isn't even just nationally or corporately, but even in our homes, when we don't make decisions, we allow a leadership gap that allows someone else to come in. And that goes back to the quote we talked about this morning. When we don't make a conscious decision of who we are and what we're going to do, someone else decides that for us. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's important for us to lead ourselves first. We have to stick our landings. We had a saying in our house. My kids hated it, but we used to, our motto was, say what you mean and mean what you say. And as a result, we didn't do too well with sarcasm because we just didn't get it. Like, we were used to saying what we mean and mean what we say. And so someone, even when I went back into the workforce, I was like, what's he saying? I don't get it. But hey, that's all right. Small price to pay, right? The second point, we're going to spend a little bit of time on this, is ask for what you need. And we're going to talk about some very specific instructions on that. And as we referenced earlier this morning, a lot of us in this room are firstborns or firstborn daughters. We have that people-pleasing trait. And we can't help ourselves. But here's the thing we have to remember. Leaders make it happen. Followers wait for it to happen. So if we're going to make it happen, we have to ask for what we need. So there's a couple steps within this step that I want to talk about that can help us to ask in a way that it can be answered. The first one is make it actionable. And we're going to talk in a minute about how that is different than nagging. But, you know, sometimes we're asking for, and I know I do this personally, sometimes we're asking for something, or asking for help, we're asking for information or a decision, but we're just not wording it in a way that requires a response. And so back in 2010, I was working for a company. I actually was working for a university, and so my job was to enroll students online. So one of the hardest jobs I ever had in my life. But they taught us how to have the conversation and how to engage with the student and how to uncover their needs, and then how to work them through the progression of how an education is going to help them, and then you lead them through the application process. So during this training program, the managers would sit with you and they'd listen in on your phone calls, and then they would give you advice and make recommendations. And so I'll never forget, my team leader sat in on my call, and afterwards he said, you know, you did a fantastic job of connecting with him. He said, but you didn't tell him what to do. And of course, defensive, I said, well, yes, I did. He said, no. He said, let's look back at your email. He said, you need to make known clear next steps. And he said, what do you want him to do after, what's the first thing you want him to do after he gets off the phone with you? I said, I want him to go on the computer, click apply now and fill out the application. He said, then you need to tell him that. And it's true, clear next steps. And this, of course, because I'm a slow learner, it still took me a long time. And even recently, even like in the past few years, I remember realizing that I wasn't getting the response that I wanted. And I thought, what's wrong with these people, you know? And so I went back and looked at some of my emails, and I noticed something. There were no question marks in my emails. It sounds like a really silly thing, but I would ramble on and say, hey, I'm just checking to see if you got the document I sent you. Please return it to me by 3 p.m. Thank you. And what I was actually looking for is a confirmation that A, they received it, and B, they were going to get it back to me on time. But I didn't say that. That was just, you know, of information only, FYI. And we might have to strike this from the official record here, but I will tell you, I really learned that lesson when working with men. You have to be very direct. You have to, if you're married, you know, you have to, sorry, Mike, you have to ask for what you need. We don't like to do this. We do not like to do this with our husbands, with our bosses, with our kids. But remember the trick, use a question mark. Sometimes people even put in the topic line, response needed. You can do that, but question marks will do the trick. When I see that, I say, okay, I need to, there's a question here, I need a response. So I've had a lot of conversations with parents that are struggling with teenagers, and we'll go through the whole discipline thing, and they'll say, well, I'll say to them, well, do they know what the expectations are? And they'll say, well, they should. And even though we think they should, and trust me, I have teenagers, I get it. Even though we think we should, we need to tell them specifically. And you know, it's this very strange phenomenon. I've noticed it like in all realms, like from working with kids to even like top managers in high-level companies. They don't want to tell people what their expectations are. And I don't think it's because they're purposely trying to jam them up. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but we have this opposition to telling people what we need. You know, and a lot of that goes back to we don't want to be rejected. I've heard a lot of bosses say, well, they need to figure it out. That's their job. They need to figure it out. But I can tell you, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way with employees. It doesn't work that way with children. I do have a story about my Nate a little later on. If anyone knows my Nathan, great guy, but yeah, had to make the expectations clear. And so when I went to, I had the opportunity after coaching high school soccer, I had the opportunity to coach college level, be part of their coaching team. And first time, I'll never forget, the first time I met with the head coach, fantastic lady, very sweet, wasn't a whole lot into rules or guidelines. And she was telling me about all the discipline problems they had the year before. She said girls weren't showing up for practice, or they would skip a practice before a game, or they'd come to a Saturday morning game and they were hungover. Well, these women were over 21, you know. And as she talked and the more we discussed it and looked at the situation, we realized these were not discipline problems. This was a simple case that no one had ever spelled out to them what we expected from them. So we had a team meeting and we talked about the expectations and got their input on the captains did not want any of the players to be drinking the night before, even legal adults. They asked that during the season that you refrain from that. So we put together a document, code of conduct, listed when they were to be at the games, you know, an hour before time, what the expectation was. If you missed a practice, you didn't play in the next game, or you didn't start in the next game. What the expectation was for behavioral things, alcohol use and everything else. We did not have a single problem the entire year. We had the ladies sign off on that document, and that they understood. And sometimes it is really, really as simple as making our expectations clear. Part of making things actionable is developing it into a process. How many of you are process driven? Okay, so in my day job, I am a process manager. So a lot of what I do is, the Gantt charts and the organizational charts and the swim charts and developing process manuals and root cause analysis, and all for uncovering the problem and correcting it by developing a process. So basically what happens is when there's a major problem and something's going wrong, I get called in to clean it up. So this can be, Val and I work in a construction company, so this can be as simple as we're not getting paid for jobs because there's paperwork missing or it's not submitted on time, or we were getting safety violations because our guys were not following the protocols required by OSHA. So you develop it into a process. A process is kind of like a recipe, right? So a recipe tells you what ingredients you need and what you need to do in which order. And when you deviate from that, you get a different result, right? So that's the same thing with the process. But this creating a process isn't just limited to major corporations with hundreds of employees. A process can be a very powerful tool even in your own home. And I'll give you an example with my 15-year-old son. So Nick's a great kid. Like every other teenage boy I know, likes to sleep in, and did great on getting up for school till he reached, about 7th, 8th, 9th grade. And so after a couple months of yelling at him for not getting ready on time, we sat down with him and I said, okay, what time does your bus come? Bus comes at 7 o'clock. I said, how much time do you need to get ready? He said, about 20 minutes. I said, okay, we talked to Dad. Dad said he needs to be downstairs 10 minutes before the bus comes to make sure he has his shoes on and his backpack and everything. So we created a process. The alarm goes off at 6. He needs to be out of bed at 6:20. He needs to be downstairs at 6:40. And actually his bus comes at 6:50. So I threatened to, write that up and post it on the fridge, but he said he had it under control. You can see how I make my children crazy. And it's not perfect, but he knows what the expectations are. And, now he's 15, but he's working a job. So he knows that if he can't get up and go to school and he can't keep up with his grades, he loves this job. He loves washing dishes for a restaurant. More power to him. Yeah. So, but that's a process. And I think we can all think of ways that we can incorporate processes where they're going to help us achieve what we need to do in order to make something actionable. The second one is be persistent. If you're like me, this isn't your favorite thing to do. We don't want to risk offending anybody. We don't want to aggravate them. We don't want to be called names. My last job, I was very persistent, and they called me persistent to my face. I don't think that's really what they used when I wasn't around. But, research firms, marketing firms have said that it takes 3 touches before someone will respond to like an ad. You ladies that are here, you probably got more than one reminder from me. So sometimes it takes more than one time. And, if I can be very real here, there was a time when I didn't like this and I was afraid to do this, and I actually found that I was setting people up for failure. So what would happen is I would make plans with a friend, and for like a month out, and I would keep it on my calendar, and I knew when it was came up, but I purposely tested her. Instead of following up and saying, hey, just want to make sure that we're still meeting tomorrow because we haven't talked for a month, I would wait to see if she would come. And I thought, you know, that's a trap. It's a trap for her, that's a trap for me. That's not helping anybody. And we always say, oh, well, we didn't want to bother them. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm a scatterbrain. Like, I need more than one reminder. And you know, it's not just about, persistence isn't just about a courtesy. So I read a story in this book. So I told you the management side of this extreme ownership. I'm going to tell you a story from the SEAL team side of their book. So the other writer, his name was Jocko, told a story about when they were securing Fallujah back in 2004, and he was the commander of the SEAL team unit. Well, the SEAL teams had been sent to Fallujah to secure and provide overwatch for the Army troops that were coming in later that evening. So his guys went out and they found a high spot to set up their watch, and a few hours later the Army troops came in, and so in the course of the middle of the night, Jocko was back at the command center, and a call came in that there were enemy snipers in the area. And you can imagine that was a very precarious situation. Everyone's blood pressure went up. You know, not only were there enemy fighters, there were enemy fighters with you know, sniper rifles and engages and very sophisticated weapons. So it was the tanker that sent this message back to the Army commander. So the Army commander and the SEAL commander are all in the same tactical operations center. And so he asked for permission to engage. So Jocko was right there, and he said to him, hey, he said, can you just give me a minute to confirm with my guys their position? So, so the tanker had found troops on Building 79, okay? So he knew his guys were supposed to be in Building 94. So he called them, he said, I need you to confirm 100% your position. And so they got out their map, their battle map, and they counted the number of buildings, and they said, look, if you look on the map, you'll see Building 94 is in the L shape. That's where we're at, 100%, we're in Building 94. So that came back, and so now, you know, it didn't take a long time, but it took long enough. Tensions are rising. So the commander gave, the Army commander gave permission to engage. And so Jocko stopped him and he said, can I ask you a favor? Think about this. These men, neither one was in the other one's line of what's it called? Command, thank you. He literally said, can I ask you a favor? So of course this guy was very clearly annoyed, and he said, just get final confirmation from your men what they're seeing. So he calls down to his tank operator, who's anxious to engage as well because he knows that his guys are in the line of fire, and if anything happens and the enemy fires on them, that he's responsible. So he's now clearly annoyed. They said, we need 100% confirmation from your guys where they're seeing the enemy. So they waited, you know, it should have taken about 30 seconds, and they waited, and they waited, and they knew something was wrong. It was taking too long. About 3 minutes later, they got back on and they said, correction, suspected enemy fighters in Building 94. They said we had misjudged our distance from the city center. In that instant, that could have changed. Now, unfortunately, those things still happen. But of course, the order was given to hold your fire, friendlies in the area, and that was averted. But I want you to think about this. How about a lesser leader that then would be called in to account for that and go before the inquiry board? You know, what if he were to say, well, what do you want me to do? I mean, I asked them twice. I mean, think about that. You know, I can't help it they gave me the wrong information. Do you want him to lead you or lead, you know, several of us have have kids in the military. Is that who you want? No, he was persistent. You know, he even violated the chain of command to do that. But I know this idea of being persistent, you know, none of us are military commanders. I don't think many of us are CEOs. But yet, this works for us as well. And I know it makes some of us uncomfortable. Like, I get that. In fact, I was having a discussion with my mother, and I was telling her what I was talking on and about being persistent. And she said, nope, I'm not going to do it. She said, I'm going to take someone else's class. Oh, wait, I can't. No, this is the only game in town. But I do get it. But you know what? You'll have to take it from me. Look at Luke chapter 11. Or I'm sorry, Matthew 7:7. We'll get to Luke chapter 11 in a second. Matthew 7:7. Jesus said, keep on asking and you will receive what you ask for. Keep on seeking and you will find. Keep on knocking and the door will be open to you. And then in Luke, he tells a story about, suppose you went to a friend's house at midnight wanting to borrow 3 loaves of bread. You say to him, a friend of mine just arrived. I have nothing to feed him. Can you help me? And he calls out, he says, go away. He said, we're all in bed, the door's locked, and we can't help you. But I tell you this, though he won't do it for friendship's sake, if you keep knocking long enough, he will get up and give you whatever you need because of your shameless persistence. So now, of course, Jesus here was talking about prayer, and I think many of us understand that. But think about this. If God, the creator of the universe, who knows every need before we ever had a single one, wants us to ask and ask again and knock and keep knocking, how much more with fallible human beings with short attention spans? Agreed? So just real quickly, I want to talk about the difference between persistence and nagging. And here's what I see. You know, there is a fine line there, but here's what I see as the main difference. Nagging is stated in a negative way. You never help me. You always, take your mother's side. I told you to change my oil 3 months ago. Instead of making it actionable. Instead of waiting till they're in a position where they can answer your request. And we're going to talk a little more later about even the difference between providing them with the information they need instead of waiting till he's in front of the television and say, well, did you call the doctor? Things like that. So C, or 3 is allow for consequences. So as I stated, Val and I work for a construction company, and we were having lunch one day with some of the field guys, and this guy Mike, who we think very highly of, he's a great guy, young family. He was telling us a story about, obviously there's always incidents in the field, and something sliced his leg, and he started to bleed, but men, being men, he patched it up and went back to work. Well, so he went home that night and didn't go to the ER. Got up and went to work the next day, and he was telling us, and he goes, yeah, he said, I eventually went to the ER. He said, because my wife cut off the food supply. And we were like, wait, what? He's like, yeah, she told me until you go to the doctors and have that looked at, I'm not making dinner. I said, that's the best story I ever heard. I love this woman. But we have to allow for consequences. And I'm going to tell you a story about my son, Nate. Our oldest is 25. He is now active military. He's in the Air Force. He is an electrician on the C-17s. He's doing fantastic. We're very proud of him. But there was a time. So back when he was in high school, we were really concerned because he didn't seem to have a plan for what he wanted to do when he got out of high school. So this is now early senior year when everyone's applying to schools or finding jobs. And every time I'd say to him, Nate, what's your plan? Why do you keep asking me what my plan is? I'm like, oh, okay. Well, as it became more and more clear that he didn't have a plan and he didn't have a plan to get one, I came up with my own plan. I enrolled him in college. Now, before you start to think that this is enabling behavior, I got to explain a couple things here. So, yes, I filled out the application, Nathan Travis, 18 years old, and all that fun stuff, and sent it into Liberty University, which I graduated from there. Great school, nothing wrong with it. Very conservative, dry campus, 7 hours from our house, and I picked that school because I knew it was the last place in the world he wanted to be. And so when the acceptance letter came in, yay, Nate, we got accepted. We sat down and I said, okay, here's the deal. I said, the deposit's due in 60 days. You have exactly 60 days to get yourself, to find a college, to get enrolled and accepted, or we're making this deposit, we will take you down there, you won't have a car on campus, and we will pick you up on breaks. Well, that must have terrified him, because I don't think it took more than a month, and just like magically, he was enrolled at Cal U, thank you. And later I remember him saying, I love college. I don't know why I didn't want to go to college. Yeah, well, he liked it a little too much, but that's a story for another time. And I remember right before he joined the military, I remember another discussion that I had with him, and just telling him how proud we were, and that he was making a really good choice. And he said, he was like surprised, and he said, oh, what'd you think? I was going to live in your basement and play video games the rest of my life? I went, no. Nate, that never occurred to me. So, but like I said, I only tell you that story because he's doing great. Yeah, but there has to be consequences. And real quickly too, the difference between enabling and empowering, and we're going to talk about empowering here in a minute, the two kind of connect, is enabling is giving them everything that they need. So it's a difference between what I call the push and the pull factor. So Nate needed a push or a kick, but sometimes we pull people, meaning that we're in front and we're pulling them behind us. Empowering or allowing for consequences will never directly shield someone from the consequences of their action or inaction. Does that make sense? Okay, so the last point today is empower others to act. And I learned the hard way, like everything else. Telling someone is not the same as communicating with them. And even before when we were talking about being persistent, oftentimes we say, when we find out that someone didn't do something, we say, well, we told them. Well, we can tell them, but it's not the same as communicating. It's not the same as empowering them. It's not the same as getting their feedback. And I work as a consultant, process consultant, organizational development. And so I met with a client who was a small business owner in a manufacturing company, and one of his biggest problems, he said, was one of his departments, they were complaining people would come in to get their shipments and they wouldn't be ready and they never knew, they just weren't happy with the customer service at all. So we called Pat down to the office just to have a discussion to see what was going on, what we could do to make things better. And so the owner, made it clear what the expectation, what he would like to see happen. And so then I said to Pat, I said, well, is there anything you need from Joe, who was the owner of the company? And he goes, yeah. He said, I don't know when the shipments are coming in. And so this was a small time business, and the owner was the one that actually did the ordering. But they were a little behind on the technology side. And yes, he realized that he was not giving him the information that he needed to have the shipments ready to go out. So in this 10-minute conversation, what they figured out is they set up a 5 p.m. meeting. So, after most of the business day was over, Joe would come up to the office because it was about, 200 yards further down, and we made him a fillable form that he could laugh at my daughter because I'm like the fillable form queen, that he could put what orders were coming in and what orders were going out. And when I talked to the owner, just to follow up with him a couple weeks later, he said, wow, he said, that's been amazing. He said, Joe actually comes up to the meeting, like I don't even call him to remind him, because he finally feels empowered to do his job. So again, just quick recap on what we're talking about here, how to increase our influence. And the points, number 1 is make it actionable. Okay, we talked about the different steps. Make it into a process, even if it's something silly and stupid like I was telling you about. Make it into a process. Number 2 is be persistent. The third one is allow for consequences. And D is empower others to act. And, if we look at the reasons why we don't empower others to act and we don't want to be persistent, it all comes down to fear. If you think about it, at its very root, fear of failure, fear of disappointment, fear of embarrassment, fear of being annoying, on and on and on. Going back to our story earlier, how about Sonia Carson? She knew at some point her sons were going to uncover the fact that she couldn't read and that she was still forcing them to write these reports. True leaders, that's what they do. We have to overcome that fear, and we have to go beyond that, and we have to give others what they need and ask for what we want, because at the end of the day, leaders make it happen, followers wait for it to happen. Let's pray. Jesus, Lord, we just thank you for this incredible day that we've had so far. Lord, these women that are so eager to learn and just want to improve themselves and want to be the best they can be. God, we ask you that you help us all that you bring to mind what we need to do. And these things are uncomfortable. Nobody likes to change. We don't like to change. But God, I ask that you give every woman in this room what they need to be successful, Lord, that you give them direction as you gave Sonia when she called out to you, that you give us all your guidance and your wisdom. And Lord, we just thank you for your Holy Spirit. We thank you for your word. Jesus, we just thank you for all that you do. In your name we pray. Amen. Now, real quickly before I release you, and then Tammy's going to be, there is one thing I do want to say, if I can have your attention just for a couple more minutes. And so what we've been talking about so far is we've kind of gone on the assumption that, the speakers, you've heard them talk about their personal relationships with Jesus. And, if we're going to be leaders, it has to start God has to be our owner. And if we're going to lead ourselves first. And this may be a new concept to you, or you may have heard it, or it may have been something that you've known about, but you just haven't taken steps to follow that. I ask you right now that you make that decision, that Jesus is your owner, that you want to be empowered by the Holy Spirit to lead yourself better and to lead others better. We're going to break into small groups after Tammy's done, but this will give you an opportunity. If you made that decision or you need more information to be able to make that decision, please talk to us, talk to any of the leaders. We'd be happy to talk through it with you. You may not be ready to make that decision, that's okay. We want to make sure, we want to empower you to make a good decision. We want to give you all the information that you need. So I do ask that you talk to us, and trust that God will lead you in that. Thank you.